Hi, my name is Nicholas Howard, and I will be doing a presentation on stress management. My presentation will include the central role of the brain and how it affects socioeconomic status of an individual, as well as the eating disorders for a person who is training and how they deal with those effects, along with college athletes and what coping mechanisms they use when dealing with stressors. For my first article, central role of the brain in stress and adaptation links to socioeconomic status, health, and disease. The purpose of this study was to draw links between stress-related processes surrounded within the social environment. The hypothesis gained from this was that physical behaviors give feedback to affect functional and structural neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is basically if things will continue for that person or that individual throughout life. Now, the big thing about this was what happens when they're young, will that affect them in the future? The design of this study was broken down in two ways. They did a survey for adolescents between the ages of 19 and 28, as well as they also did a survey on animals to find the link between the two. The individuals that dealt with the survey dealt with top-down strategies intended to alter the brain function in ways to switch their thinking of socioeconomic status. The limitations that came from this article was the use of animals and the evidence shown in relation to humans. There was little relation, but the only problem was that there weren't enough studies on both the animal side and the participant side. One of the strengths was that they determined what is stressful by supporting the conscious and unconscious judgment processors, which determined the health damaging and health promoting behaviors that resulted. So to take from that was that from all the stress things, they found out ways to support per stress effect and deal with that mechanism right then and there. In conclusion, a sense of control and self-esteem and systematic pathways by which stress causes socioeconomic decision, you can find health and longevity. So by giving someone a way of dealing with their stress levels through self-control or helping encourage them or give them self-esteem really helps their health and gets rid of all stress diseases, stress factors, and any negative effects on socioeconomic stress. For our next article, the title of it is Night Eating Syndrome: Effects of Brief Relaxation Training on Stress, Mood, Hunger, and Eating Patterns. The purpose of this study was to determine whether the relaxation and intervention could help reduce the amount of stress on individuals. There were multiple hypotheses drawn from this article. One of the biggest ones was that if they use APRT, which is abbreviated progressive muscle relaxation therapy, they would significantly reduce both subjective and endocrinology index of stress, as well as the population from reducing that stress will have comparable effects to NES, which is one of their own personal abbreviations, acronyms that stood for night eating disorder. To try to draw that all in together, basically relaxation training would adjust someone's appetite and kind of lessen their eating disorder and make their eating times better than all at night. The design of this study included 20 adults that have been suffering from night eating syndrome, which is basically those who binged or only ate once or twice a day, and if their second meal was after 9 o'clock. The limitations and strengths, one of the limitations was the number of participants. I feel that because they were at a college, they definitely could have used about 50 participants, but they only had 20. And it kind of shows little, a short term effect, and not trying to do a wide range of people who can participate into the study to give you a bigger and broader result. One of the strengths taken from this was that the use of several self-report measures and provided a lot of stress assessments and data collection. So from their 20 participants, there were multiple scales of data collected. It ranged from the neuroendocrine measure of stress all the way to the collection of the time they woke up, the time they felt like eating, whether they ate or not, and whether they ate or not, or whether they chose not to eat at night. And the biggest finding from all of this was that most people who train often put their eating habits to the end because they don't feel like they have the energy or time to deal with food. And if so, it takes time and they're eating late at night. In conclusion, APRT can be chosen as an intervention to prove the consistency and change of someone's destructive cycle when eating. Using APRT will create that balance for someone's life that will bring their eating decisions more easily instead of stressing them about them and then causing them to eat later and deal with a certain type of eating syndrome. For my third article, titled "The Stress and Coping Response of Certified Graduate Athletic Training Students." The purpose of the study was to assess the source of stress and how certain college athletic training students coped with it and dealt with them on a daily basis. The hypothesis drawn was that high stress is due to high caseloads and more hours expected of them, even though they don't have a lot of control of their time, as well as the conflict of dealing with the athletes and their own personal problems back at home. The design consisted of three male graduate athletic training students as well as 3 female graduate athletic training students who just finished and just received certification of a athletic training program. The students were interviewed 3 times over a 9-month period, just to kind of like keep a track and give them time to feel comfortable, as well as jot down the data so that you had a long-term conclusion, is what I would say. They used a grounded theory, which used an analytic procedure to analyze participant sources of stress and coping responses verbatim. So everything in the study there was no paraphrasing. They really took from the students word for word, and from them taking word for word, they kind of like understood and caught on to what stresses affected them more and what stresses affected them less. One of the limitations, I would say again, is that they had such a small group. Also, being out of college, they could interview multiple students, or they could have did more students in half the time in about 4 or 5 months, and about 30 students, or possibly 60, 30 male, 30 females, because it would give you a bigger age range, a wider age range, as well as certain ways to cope with common stressors that a lot of students have. One of the strengths taken away from this article was the use of different stress levels that they categorize, which resulted in them making interventions for per participant for all 6 participants. Each one was given a certain type of intervention, which mainly focused on the 2 things that affected them negatively. Multiple sessions of relaxation were recorded, which I feel like was a really good characteristic and showed strength in the article, not only because it was for such a long time, but it also showed that the information was right there. It was 100% accurate, and it was received and put into data. Um, in conclusion, for this article, dimensions of stress were located from all interviews. The most common consisted of athletic training comparing to job duties for these participants, as well as responsibilities as a student, like class, homework, um, and also time management back at home. Because they dealt with graduate school as well as the team, as well as what they had to do outside of school, it kind of brought on future concerns for these participants. Um, for the 6 individuals, they the article felt that it was insistent in the future that in the future research direction from the study would help create more interventions for students as well as individuals or other collegiate athletes that need help with dealing with stress and dealing with the best ways to cope with them. One of the biggest problems personally for me when I was playing baseball here was that you had to always make sure you were ahead of the game, and you had to also make sure that nothing held you back. So from saying that, it was more of a make sure things were done, make sure I prepared myself for the next day, and in doing that, you really see that you have not much time for yourself. And then when you try to put time on yourself, what you're doing is that you're creating stress and more problems for things that are expected of you the next day. Um, Overall, from all 3 articles, I found out that 2 of the most important things is intervention and physical activity, as well as social integration throughout finding ways to cope with stressing, as well as finding ways to alleviate stress and keep it at a very low and not become such a major factor of one's life. Also, by influencing unfavorable factors associated with night eating syndrome, stress. Sorry. Unfavorable factors associated with night eating syndrome can lead to stress, mood swings, terrible eating patterns, unprecedented hunger, as well as weight fluctuation, especially if that person was training to get to a certain level. What you can see from this night eating syndrome is that APRT is one of the possible best choices for dealing with that syndrome. Choosing certain interventions prove a consistent change and also can help a participant. And lastly, they all sources identified common stress and coping responses. One of the biggest thing was for all of the surveyors and the people who conducted the study to really focus on certain ways to relax the mind, because relaxing the mind puts the individual at ease and also gives the individual the opportunity to have a better status within himself and externally. And that is it. Thank you again for your time. I truly appreciate it, and hope you have a good weekend.